In this episode, we interview Imran Ahmad, the COO and CFO of Health iPASS, which was acquired by Sphere. Tons of gems, tons of nuggets that you can get out of this episode, and the audio quality does give off some feedback as Imran gets a little bit louder, but this episode is worth listening to all the way through. It's one of our shorter ones at 45 minutes, so give us a listen. If you like it, please like and subscribe and give us a follow. Let's jump into the episode. Imran, thank you so much for joining us. Here at the Bell Curve, we're all about equipping young professionals and aspiring entrepreneurs with the knowledge and tools to launch their own ideas. We're particularly excited to feature you, who's basically achieved every startup exec's dream, scaling the company to successful exit. And so with that, I'll pass it to Tom to do your formal intro.
Yeah, with that type of intro, I mean, that's aggressive to start things off, but I'll take it.
So, Imran, you started your career as an investment banker and made your way into private equity before really crushing it in the big leagues as a VC general partner, healthcare IT startup founder, and then you've really done a lot from scaling Health iPASS to the successful exit where you were COO and CFO, and then going through an acquisition with a PE-backed company, Sphere, and just a year and a half ago, right?
That's right.
December 2020?
About 20 months ago.
So, yeah, I mean, and you're there now as SVP of Growth and Strategy. And man, we have so much to dig into. So, Imran, great to have you with us. And thanks so much for just making the time here during your family trip to Boston.
Absolutely, man. No, I'm happy to do it. And it's always good to reconnect.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
So you kind of did something. You went to Chicago. A lot of our listeners we're finding are within our networks. We're Cornell guys. We got some folks here that we've seen are in the major metros going to elite universities here. So you did right out of college the investment banking thing for 2 years, and then you were basically in PE for 2 years before actually making the jump to actually go and co-found your first startup, which I believe you did as an MBA student. So.
That's right.
One of the things that we want to kind of touch on and kind of pick your brain is when you were going through those 4 years being in corporate America, basically from 22 to 26, 27, do you feel like that background in finance, that background seeing deals in private equity and a lot of the things that you were doing kind of equipped you and gave you the skills to actually jump off and be successful basically within that first company? Or do you think it was just a complete waste of time? And, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you just pedal to the metal, 22, 23, go for it and, see if you can make something out of it.
Look, I respect the heck out of the 22, 23-year-olds who are going for it and trying to make it their way through the market. But for me, at least, I absolutely think it was a big skill set for me, right? I'm not a developer. I didn't have an engineering background. I wasn't a maker per se. And, I needed to get some ground-based level skills. And going through investment banking is a fantastic way to, compress 4 years of education into 2 years of just grind it out, work to the bone sort of mentality. And I thought that was phenomenal. I was at a small firm at the time called William Blair. We did mid-market investment banking. And so I got a chance to see these companies that had really started from their gestation and were still founder-led. They were still family-led businesses thinking about their exit horizon and what they were doing. And so you get a little bit of a feel. But the bigger learning for me, honestly, Jacob, was that when I was going through that process, I grew up pretty modestly. I mean, we had my dad never made more than $25,000 in his entire career. We were a family of 6. And I entered the fray of investment banking, and I was exposed to just people who were very different. And I, for example, had never flown on a commercial flight without my parents accompanying me. Just couldn't afford it before that time period. And the idea of doing pre-check-in just basic things, right? That people feel the need to get through adulthood didn't really have. And so when I got through that investment banking experience, I felt like I was a lot more equipped to go up the stratosphere and down the stratosphere to the point where like I wasn't intimidated by people anymore. When I first entered, I felt like I was intimidated. Oh, he's the partner at William Blair, and I was a little bit itchy to go into that office, and I didn't want to go into that office, right, without a reason. And so you develop that level of comfort, and you say, they're just like me. In fact, some of them may just have lucked into it, just like I lucked into that job, I felt like, right? And so that gave me a lot more perspective and a lot different way of approaching things. And then when I went to the private equity firm, we were a very operationally focused PE fund. So we would really get into the weeds with our portfolio companies. And so I was looking at these CEOs and whomever that I was working with very directly. And again, understanding that I was actually providing value, right? I wasn't just like the guy who just peppered a couple questions. It was, hey, Imran, I need you to figure out how we'd run inventory in a different way that was more specialized. Or, hey, Imran, our sales strategy is broken. Go ride along with our VP of sales and figure out what the heck he's doing and if it's good or useful or if it's not. And I feel like a lot of people sort of just think of, oh, you're a finance guy. And typically, if you're a PE guy, if you're in investment banking, you're just modeling, right? You're behind the shadows. And I felt like the exposure that I had got me a little bit more into the weeds with our portfolio companies and spending time on the operational side. And that's where I caught that bug. I loved working with these guys who were building something as opposed to financial restructuring or figuring out how many turns of debt you can put on something, right? Which is what you do in private equity when you're doing LBOs for the most part. And shifting away from that mentality was really pretty cool.
Nice. That's awesome. And for the listeners, LBOs is leverage buyouts, which, private equity firms are using just a ton of debt to basically pick up these startups. And, you raise the money to put the equity portions in, and you're structuring deals so that you guys can actually get your controlling interest.
Think of it like a person buying a house and trying to put as little down payment as you possibly can and getting the biggest mortgage. It's no different when you're buying a company.
That's a great analogy, actually. Yeah.
You just bridged Jake and my worlds there.
There you go.
Like real estate.
Yeah, I actually have a blog post about how private equity, investment banking, venture capital all relate to the real estate industry because they're all kind of similar. It's just, the investment banker is the same thing as the real estate agent, right? There's not really a ton of difference at the end of the day. You're brokering buying and selling of businesses as opposed to buying and selling of houses, right?
Yeah, I feel like in college, when they're kind of selling you on which career path to go, basically everything kind of looks the same at the end, but you don't really know that. So you're like in your late 20s, early 30s, you're like, oh, crap. Investment banking is basically just what I'm doing as a real estate broker, but for business and vice versa. Basically, a lot of the same skills. And if
that's
I
right.
did it all over again, I just go into the one who pays more, which clearly is investment banking. So you won on that one. Cool. So let's transition into, so you do the investment banking thing, you do the private equity thing, that kind of spans about 4.5 years. You're going then into B school, right? So now it's kind of the time, you're making a decision, you go to Booth, and then it seems like at Booth, you got your kind of entrepreneur journey started there. And so that started with the company.
Yeah, actually a little bit before Booth. So before I went to Booth, Jake, I basically, was lured by one of my cousins who was at Hopkins at the time and said, hey, I have this amazing idea. He said he has this amazing idea for a staff, like call schedule management solution, right? And so we whipped up the software. I used a bunch of Pakistani developers. It was my first time really getting into the weeds, trying to build a product, going out, trying to sell it didn't really work all that well for us. It wasn't like this next big thing that I expected it to be. I realized some market forces were preventing that from being the case, and not having a tech team, native that I was willing to hire was a problem. But it was my first real exposure to actually starting something that was tech product and getting those wheels spinning. Because again, I was doing everything healthcare or whatever it was, not really layering in technology into what I was doing historically. And so that is when I went to Booth, and I actually had that notion in my brain, right? Like I'd started something, it wasn't like anything big. It was only a couple months of a project. But then when I went to Booth, a similar situation, except one of my buddies was doing his MD PhD at the time at Booth, or at University of Chicago. And he was doing his MD PhD. I was back for business school. And we both went to undergrad together at the University of Chicago as well. And so he calls me and he's like, "Hey, Imran, you got to check this out, man. I got something to show you." And I was like, "Okay, what is it?" And he takes me to the basement of one of our buildings at University of Chicago. And in the basement, there are thousands of mice. And they're in cages. And all these mice. And I'm just like, "Omar, what is all this stuff?" And he's like, "These are all mice that we use in research." And there are almost 100,000 mice sitting in the basement of one of these buildings at University of Chicago. And you sit there and you're like, "Oh my goodness, what are we doing with this?" And he says, "Well, every cage that you look at has these note cards on it. Because the only way they managed all of these animals was through this like orange note card versus a pink note card versus somebody saying, 'Oh, there's 4 mice on here today and they're breeding. These are breeding mice.'" And like there was no real constructive way of managing these animals. And it just befuddled us. And Omar had the amazing idea to basically take this manual process and digitize it and make it an iPad app. And so that's when we set off the ground to really launch what became known as Mouse House.
Nice. And
that's like the coolest founder startup story I've ever heard.
I will tell you this. It's one of the nerdiest businesses that you can possibly have. Imagine trying to tell your wife-to-be, Tom, what you do is you help animal breeding, specifically with mice. It doesn't get you a lot of dates, I'll tell you that.
So wait, did you meet your wife before or after that?
Thankfully, I met her after that person. So that part of the business was done.
so it was a good enough idea. I mean, y'all won like the new venture challenge at Booth, like Grubhub, Braintree, Bump Technologies. They're kind of the winners of that similar award while getting off the ground. So it's like it probably had some traction. I mean, I'm assuming people were using it,
absolutely.
Like, yeah. And
we had traction. It was interesting business. Look, at the end of the day, it's super intuitive. When you tell people, stop using note cards, use this really functional iPad app to manage your animal populations. And so when we pitched it at the New Venture Challenge. We ended up winning the New Venture Challenge, which was a huge honor and something that came with some funding. And then they sent us out to Rice University for the Rice Business Plan competition. And so we're at the Rice Business Plan competition, and we get the idea to have a physical mouse walk with us. And when I say walk with us, like a mouse in a cage, when we're presenting. And so I was, the talk of the town. Omar and I were just walking around with this mouse in our cage, talking about this mouse and how we're actually helping it out. And we got the interest of a person from Fortune magazine, an author from Fortune magazine who was at the event, covering the event. And she just decided to shadow us, like was literally in our hotel room. We had a photographer in our hotel room when we were going to bed, when we woke up, as we were pitching. And lo and behold, a couple months later, we had a 4-page spread on us and Mouse House in the Fortune 500 issue of Fortune magazine. Wow. And like pictures of us all over the place. And that really, it helps jumpstart the business and give you some credibility when you can point to that and say, hey, look, we've got that going. But you know what we found out is that academic institutions just don't pay you a lot of money, right? We're selling to big academic institutions. It takes forever to sell. They don't pay you a ton of money. And the strategies that we had, it wasn't sticky enough to warrant a big, massive business, but it was always going to be a nice business. Like we signed up University of Auckland in New Zealand, King's College London. We had labs at Mass Gen and Brigham using us. So all these people started to use us, and it was a really interesting, tight community, but it wasn't a ton of dollars at the end of the day, and it didn't justify, mass expenditure of time for us, and that's where we shifted our attention.
Interesting.
I feel like the majority of the conversations I'm having with like younger folks who are thinking about breaking into entrepreneurship who don't know if they want to do it for a long time is like, just go do it, especially if you're in your 20s, because a really good outcome is like you got traction and you went basically from 0 to 1, or you built something, even if it was like, with Pakistani developers and the thing doesn't work super well. But if you have users and you have people paying you money for the same reason, like that's my definition of a business. When going from project to business is like, okay, we built something, people give us money to use it for the same reason why everybody else uses it for. And, you have, fulfillment, you have customer service, all of those things. The majority of the time, it's not going to work out. Most startups fail. However, you're going to get skills and experience that you wouldn't elsewhere. And then looks really good on a resume, and you're going to be able to leverage that to kind of get into your next gig, which, I think is a good transitioning piece for you. You leave Booth, you're doing the Mouse House thing, and then you transition over into venture.
So it was a little bit more complicated. I wish it was that simple at that point, because what happened was I started at Booth, and after my first quarter, Booth's on the quarter system. After my first quarter at Booth, I ran into a gentleman named Jason Heltzer, and we got to talking, and I interviewed at OCA, and I joined as an intern after my first quarter. So just similar to Tom, my second quarter at Booth, I was working as an intern at OCA Ventures. And that internship started going from 10 hours to 20 hours to 30 hours a week. It just kept growing. And that summer, I won the New Venture Challenge, and then I joined PayPal. Over the summer, I did my internship there. And when I was coming back, Jason gave me a call, and he's like, hey, how do you feel about coming back to OCA Ventures? And Jim Dugan was the managing partner there. Like, hey, come back, join the squad again. Effectively, we'll pay you a full-time salary while you're at Booth for your second year. I was like, no, I got this thing, Mouse House. It's a good thing going. I don't know. They're like, listen, spend 2 days a week at Mouse House, spend 3 days a week at OCA. I don't know when I'm going to do the MBA at the end of the day because I'm at OCA and Mouse House, but we figured it out. And, I was running all 3 of those balls down during my second year in business school. And then when it came time to make a decision post-business school, I was like, do I spend more time at Mouse House? Do I spend more time? Do I go back to PayPal, who had given me an offer, or do I come back and join OCA? It just made sense to join OCA because they had this thing called OCA Edge, which was a seed fund, effectively. And they basically were saying, Imran, this could be your entity to run. And it was a small shop. There were only a handful of folks at OCA. It was a great place to get learnings, as Tom knows, and really get into the flow. And I joined full-time at OCA at that point as an associate and worked my way through the ranks from associate to eventually partner over the course of 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years. So it was a nice journey, but not as simple as you left business school and you hopped on.
It's way more impressive than taking a post grad offer.
Oh, I don't know about that, but yeah, it was definitely beneficial to my wallet at the end of the day.
And also a testament to how, like, of all advanced degrees, MBAs can be done part-time, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No question about that.
Here's what, like, one thing I'm really interested in, Imran, is so what ultimately attracted you? I know you mentioned the Edge Fund, but like in terms of thinking about I am a startup founder, an executive, versus I am working with startup founders to seed their ideas, to help fund their ideas. Like, what attracted you to that kind of transition? And then obviously I know that's temporary because you then went back into operating, but like, what was your thought process back then?
So it's actually interesting. The first question I got asked in my interview from Jason Heltzer at the time, who was interviewing me, was, are you an entrepreneur or are you an investor? And my answer was, I don't know. I really like both. There are aspects of both that really appeal to me. I was glamorized by the VC role. Just everyone wants to become a VC coming out of business school in some fashion. It's weird. But when I joined OCA, I always had that thought process. Do I still want to be an investor? Do I want to be a founder? Because as an investor, you get that diversification and you're seeing new problems, new industries, new verticals every single day, right? And you're talking to these inspired entrepreneurs who are betting the farm literally on their next business idea, and they're going all in. And it's hard not to be, inspired by that. That's an incredible thing that people are doing. But then you're sitting there, and you're like, man, can I do this? Can I do this again? And that's really always, it always tears at you in those roles. And I think the best venture investors have had a ton of operating experience for that reason. They can empathize more closely with their entrepreneurs. They know the struggles that they're going through and can actually provide tangible advice as opposed to theoretical advice. But, Mike Moritz was a journalist. Who am I to say you have to be an operator? There are tons of avenues to venture, and I think that was a really interesting sort of route, but didn't mean to dilly-dally around the question, Tom. So sorry.
No, I mean, you phrased it so much better than I could, right? When I was evaluating venture and spent time at OCA and, United Health Group's venture group, ultimately I was asking myself the same question. Can I be a good investor without operating? And I was in a different position from you. You had already founded multiple startups at that point. I had not. And that really drove me to really jump into more of the early stage operating world. But in terms of kind of what you took away from that venture world, do you think that being a operator prior to that made you a better venture investor, and B, being a venture investor eventually made you a better operator later? Do you think there's this kind of synergistic back and forth?
I do think that cycle is helpful for me personally, and everyone's got a little bit of a different way of looking at things and what's beneficial and what's not. Look, neither of those two companies that I started before, Tom, were home runs, right? None of them made me what I would call independently wealthy or anything of that sort, right? So you can glamorize the early work, but effectively, you kind of failed, right? And I'll take that on the chin. Those early ones that I ended up launching weren't huge success stories. And so I think having a little bit of that gives you a real way to empathize with the entrepreneurs that you're talking to. And that's probably the biggest trait for a good VC or not. Can you show empathy towards the folks that you are working with and help them however you can? There's a lot of times you won't be able to help them. Right? That's not my skill set. It's not what I do. You asked me to help you do a code fix. I can't do it, man. But I can get you in touch with the right person potentially. And what it really did for me, Tom, which I think was useful, is it allowed me to expand my network in a way that was, supercharged, right? As a VC, I can call up any company and say, hey, man, I'm interested in talking to you, learning more. And people are usually receptive to taking that call. Similarly, my job was effectively just networking in the industry with other VCs, with other entrepreneurs, and just getting to know and generating inbound flow. And that was absolutely invaluable in terms of being able to think about good talent, not good talent, think about who are the people I want to work with going forward, and just gives you a level of exposure that you can't get in other industries because they're not, in VC, networking is your job. And so networking with startups is your job, which is a really unique twist compared to any other profession where you're focused on a silo.
Huh. So, I mean, I know Jake has been on the other side of that, right? Like raising capital from VCs. So I have to ask the question, Imran, like, do you feel like you have like a very pointy, let's say a pointed opinion on what makes for a like good investment as a VC investor? Like some people say it's mostly team, some people say it's mostly market. Like, do you kind of believe strongly one way or the other on one of those variables?
Look, it's hard to do anything without a good team. Okay. And I am of the mindset that talent matters more than almost any other thing running a company. But if you don't have those other elements, it's just not going to work, right? Like you can do whatever you want, but it still has to have an opportunity. There has to be a decent market size. I could work off of a tiny company, and that's great. With a super talented team, I could do well as a lifestyle business. But making a VC backable, massive potential business, I think team is absolutely going to be the most essential component. But you got to have those foundations and ability to adapt. And it's not just like, oh yeah, you hired a bunch of smart people, but can those people take it on the chin, right? Can they, when they get knocked down, are they going to be able to bounce back and do something different, right? And that's that grit concept that folks have started to write about more prevalently. I think that is why, like, I loved investing in folks who are like Ironman runners, right? And folks who just, they didn't know the concept of giving up and would break down walls to achieve whatever it is their core goal was. Because to me, that gave me some insight into their behavior is if things get rough, are they going to be able to plow through it? And if you were able to run an Ironman, well, I can't. So you got something in you that makes you push through when others give up.
Interesting. Well, and you bring up such interesting points. I mean, thinking about like our listeners, those who are maybe like still on the precipice of like evaluating a business idea or thinking about whether, entering the startup world is right for them. What is the general advice you give to like young entrepreneurs as in terms of telling them whether they should or shouldn't, what they should be thinking about, how they should be growing and developing and focusing their time?
Yeah, it's once you stop learning, do something else. That's the highest, most important, critical piece of advice I can give you. If you are not learning from the people who are around you, the industry, whatever it is, and you feel like you've started to stagnate, as soon as that slope starts to flatten out, go find something else, is what I would say. You always want to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. I always try to be the dumbest person in the room. But that's generic advice. The one thing that I will tell people is, I think it's great to figure out when you're truly, capped out from a learning experience. And if you're not capped out, then keep going and expand in your role and think of different roles that you can take. Part of the beauty of joining a startup early on versus, a big company is that a startup gives you some flexibility that once you're in, you can go from one role to the next role to the next role if you are able to add value and if you see a problem and you try to solve it. Like you could go from sales to client success to the VP of sales at some point, and each of those is a very different type of skill that you'd be getting. And I think versus working at a bigger company where it's the standard trajectory and you're trudging along, you're just learning opportunities are much slower, I think, and that is when I would get frustrated personally, and I think limits people's potential if they are down one track and they're not learning.
Wow, I love that. That's really pointed advice, and I think great for the folks who are really considering what success looks like.
Yeah, and I think.
Yeah, I didn't say it would get you successful, but it will keep you out of boredom. So you could fail a bunch of times, but it depends what your goal in life is. That's for sure.
So Imran, how do you go from being pure investment to then being COO, CFO of Health iPASS?
Yeah. So I was at OCA for a while and was starting to get a little bit antsy. Candidly, loved the people I was working with, loved everything about the fund and the dynamics. But I knew I was getting antsy. That same question, do I want to be a founder, or do I want to be an entrepreneur, or do I want to be an investor? And one of the companies that I invested in was a company called Health iPASS, and really just got along great with the CEO of that company, CEO and founder of that company, Raj. And was able to be in boardrooms with him, understand how he handled adversity and some of the struggles that they were really having, and talk to the folks at OCA, and we thought it was a good place for me to spend more time. And so, again, started spending a lot more time at Health iPASS to the point where I just became full-time COO, CFO of the business, and effectively was responsible for all things revenue related. So, COO, CFO is kind of a weird title because you're kind of doing everything, right? And that's how small companies are. There was no real title. You wanted a budget? Sure, I can knock out a budget for you. You needed an HR specialist? Okay, great. Tomorrow, I'm chief compliance officer, right? Like literally every single random role under the sun gets thrown at you. And I thought that was, talk about learning and drinking from a fire hose. I knew nothing about compliance the day I joined as chief compliance officer. I could do a budget with my eyes closed. That's fine. But then managing payroll and for a large organization it's a very different type of skill. And like all of these little tedious things that you don't necessarily even think about become part of that MO. And so I joined Health iPASS when it was a handful of folks, and we ended up growing the business to a pretty significant clip and selling to a large private equity firm. But during that journey, I was hiring every single person. I brought on, our head of product, who is fantastic, one of the best product people that I know and work with. But you run through adversity, and if you're not happy with the people you work with, God help you, because it's going to be a tough journey. And luckily, Raj and I, are the CEO of Health iPASS, and myself, we were thick as thieves. We became very, very close, talking every day. Our families became close together. Like it just became, at the end of the day, I was probably spending 5-6 hours a day with Raj outside of just working hours, because we were ideating and thinking about what we could do next. And so don't do a company or join a company unless you think you can love the people that you're working with.
Yeah.
And what was so different, Imran, about, I'm sure many things were different about, Health iPASS versus your other startups you're a part of, but you mentioned team chemistry. You mentioned, your role and probably like the development that happened over time. Like what do you impart as like the kind of ingredients for success?
Yeah. So I think that for Health iPASS in particular, they had 2 or 3 big things going for them. Number one was the markets were trending in Health iPASS's direction. We are a solution to help medical practices capture patient payments, right? 20 years ago, there was almost no such thing as a patient payment because insurance pretty much covered everything. Now, high deductible health plans have become more and more the norm and prevalent, such that patient payments are becoming a real pain point. And these guys, we just had the right timing to address the market issues that were popping up. And so that was part one. I think part two, as you mentioned, Tom, like we had done a bunch of research at OCA about different companies, and I got to see a lot of different companies, and you get pattern recognition when you do some of them. Not to say that it will be successful or anything like that, but you get to see the ingredients of what makes something more prone to success and what makes something not prone to success. And I love the product focus of our team to be able to actually address concerns for our customers and then build around that. And so it was customer-led product design and discovery. And that was really essential because it makes the sales job a lot easier. I could sell anything. And we'd say, yeah, we'll build it, right? But it was just this innovation mentality where we weren't going to confine ourselves to a box, and we were going to run in whatever direction the market was going to point us to in a focused way, obviously, but doing so, being nimble was something that not a lot of teams could execute upon effectively. And I think we were able to do so a little bit better than our competitor.
And how do you make the decision to exit? Right? Like, how do you know when it's the right time?
That was the most brutal decision.
Is it as calculated as like a lot of folks make it out to be? Is like, okay, we were here and then we reached out and started to see if we were going to sell this company because we were burnt out at this point. Or, hey, sometimes I hear it's like, oh, I met this guy at a networking conference and, he really liked me and our business and he offered to buy us. And, that's how we got the process started.
Yeah, it was more kind of like the latter. I mean, look, we entered this conversation knowing at some point we were going to sell the company, right? Like sell or go public. Like we knew that there was an exit at some point for this company. We weren't going to do this for the rest of our lives. But when we were, we'd raised money from some big VCs who wanted a massive, multi-billion-dollar go public or go home kind of mentality. And, it was really a struggle. We got introduced to a potential buyer, 2 years before we ended up selling. And we were just talking to them and catching up. It wasn't in a buy conversation. We actually went out to raise our Series B, Jacob. And in that process, somebody said, I'll invest. Maybe I'll just buy it. And put in the LOI. And then we actually ran a process. We ran a small process with an investment banker. And we said, okay, well, the offer is interesting enough for us to consider at the very least, right? We got to think about this smartly. Do we want to go for the glory and raise a Series B and spend 5-6 more years building this business up to what we think its potential is? Or do we want to, cash in some of the chips and go, you're thinking about who the buyer is. We had a couple of offers come in for the business, which was exciting. And, you're going through the diligence process with large public companies, private equity backed companies, and whomever, right, who are interested in this asset. And we thought we wanted to go with the best fit, right? Where could we spend some time with, have a really nice financial outcome, but at the same time, potentially get a second bite of the apple, potentially, be in a position where we can capitalize on the business. A good home for our team was super important, right? Are they going to treat the folks around us with respect and dignity? Do we like the people that we're with? Because if we don't, that's going to be problematic, right? And 20 months later, I'm still with the company, right? So I think it gives you a sign for how things have progressed. But it was a very nice outcome. We thankfully are in a pretty good, very different position than we were 20 months ago before we sold.
Well, and Imran, like that whole process you mentioned, like you obviously got to invest. Was it in the seed round or Series A round of Health iPASS?
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah. So you invested in both those rounds, right? And then you got to join when it was early, right? So probably had some revenue, but then by the time you sold to your private equity buyer, you'd really scaled that. So like tell me about just what was it like being COO and CFO, like owning revenue, and basically like that's kind of the key ingredient. That's the golden ticket there for a company. What was it like in that scaling process? Like how different was the day to day for you? How much did you have to flex new muscles, and like how did you even approach like your own process of being a leader?
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. I'll start with that. And you would not believe the amount of gaps that I had from a skill perspective going into this. And I still think I have a ton of gaps, right? I'm no pro when it comes to selling, but things like establishing basic processes and a sales ops strategy and collateral and what are you actually selling and how are you positioning your go-to-market? Now, okay, now I got to reach out to people. Who are the people I'm even calling? Like, how do I get their contact information? That's one of the hardest parts of a startup sales process is like, who am I selling to? And then how am I going to get their email? How am I going to get their phone number? Like, what's the right way to do it? You just do Google searches? Is that the strategy? Or, can you build something more scalable, more sustainable? And those were the pieces that you really have to set up and establish and go through. And we got to a really nice point where we started to have a model that worked where you can add a widget and know what the output was generally. That model is broken down 3 or 4 times since that point, right? But it's a constant iteration process. And actually, our current president at Sphere, who I really, really, truly enjoy and love working with because I learn a ton from, every time we get on a call, he's like, okay, what do we do differently? We tried this, it failed. What do we do different now? And so that experimentation process, which I think is so invaluable, right? Like you really want to make sure that you're running experiments constantly and addressing and learning from those. Otherwise, you're going to risk stagnation. Unless, you figure out some magic trick, you always have to iterate and experiment.
Well, and that process of like experimenting, in an early stage company, right? Like the governance is so different. You can just have an idea at 8 a.m. over a cup of coffee and have it in practice by noon, right? Whereas now you're part of a bigger company. How much does that differ? And how do you think about just like the difference in even like what you are bringing to market at Health iPASS now being part of a private equity as opposed to VC backed company?
Yeah, it's very different. And I will say there is a much harder impetus on budget and forecast and did you hit your numbers this month or did you not hit your numbers? And we can't spend X, Y, Z, right? It's just the amount of regulation that you deal with. And it's a different mentality, right? Like you're in a very different ship. And I think it's been a fantastic learning experience to figure out what it is that they look for in in this mentality that's different from when I was in venture backed. We had money to spend and it was growth beyond, it didn't really matter what the growth looked like. I was just going to grow. Right. And allocate those resources accordingly versus now it's growth and expenses. And, what do we do to, grow in a little bit more calculated way. And I think it's been a shift. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Well, and you've been in a lot of different rooms at this point, right? Imran, you've been in the seat where you're raising money.
Private equity is really a bit more about like disciplined growth. It's like you use the word calculated in private equity. I've never worked in private equity, so I don't really know how it is.
You guys,
some people have some strong opinions on it, but
it's disciplined growth. I think that's a great way to frame it, and I think it's a unique skill in of itself to get to that level.
And so I think my internet might have cut out there, Imran, but my question was, you've been in a lot of rooms, right? So you've been, asking, you've been in investor meetings, you've been in investment committee meetings, you've been in executive team meetings, board meetings. So what is your kind of guidance to folks who are earlier in their career, who are earlier in this process of like ideation and the startup world for how to flex appropriately and how to really adapt among all those different environments.
Yeah, that's the Hamilton analogy. You want to be in the room where it happens, right? At the end of the day. And so for those who've not watched Hamilton, you should, and you'll understand the reference. But at the end of the day, if you're early in your career, being a fly on the wall is a incredibly useful thing. And so even just being silent observer, but getting to see the interactions, it makes you less intimidated when you are in that role. And you want to get yourself those reps. I remember, for example, when I was a sophomore in college at the University of Chicago, I had an opportunity to intern at the Pritzker organization, which was the family office for the Pritzker family. And I had read Barbarians at the Gate. And now I was literally in the room with three of the people from Barbarians at the Gate. And another, the other guy who was in the room with me ended up being the CEO of Hyatt Hotels. And it was just, and there were like 10 people in that room with me. And it was incredible, that level of exposure. Was I valuable? No. I didn't know what EBITDA was. EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. They were throwing around lingo. I didn't know what it meant, but I was still soaking everything up and trying to be an active participant, or even if I wasn't active, just learning from those around me. And so you want to put yourself in uncomfortable situations where it may be, above your weight class, right? But in order to get to that weight class, you need to get in that room in the first place, and you need to see what's happening. And I think that has always been, a useful tool to me. If you're early in your career, it may not be as easy to get access to those types of opportunities, but taking that stretch and trying to even telling people, hey, I'm here to learn. And specifically, I would say, my wife works for a company called the Mom Project, and she talks about a lot, and she spent a lot of time with diversity and inclusion and trying to figure out, women, how they get into that room, because historically, for some reason, that was never like a cultural norm, 50, 100 years ago, right? And that's changing over the course of time, thank God. And now I've got two daughters, right? And I'm trying to make sure that every single thing that they can do is putting them into that position so that they can be in that room. I think specifically, I've seen a lot more people ask to be involved in that decision, to see what's happening in the board meetings. And I think, men, women, non-binary, anything, you gotta put yourself in that position, because for whatever reason, historically, men have always tried to push their way into that door more aggressively. And I think you gotta go, the extra mile there.
Wow. Imran, this has been amazing, getting to catch up and hear, I think, just this focus on having a growth mindset, pursuing challenges, embracing failure, taking it on the chin, really just like finding the right team and just putting the pedal to the metal. I think this is so useful to, I know, both of us as we think about our own professional journeys, and I know it's going to be great for our listeners. So can't thank you enough for joining us here on the Bell Curve and talking about what it's like to sit at the top of that bell curve, where you are.
I'm not at the top, I'll say that, but I will say that it's been awesome spending some time with you guys and learning more. There's a ton of room. I don't want to glorify the small amount of successes that we've had, because there's been a lot of failure in that process, and there's bound to be more success and more failure, I hope. So, and that's just part of the journey. So thank you guys so much for having me, and appreciate the time.
Amazing. Well, Imran, we'll stop the recording now. Hold on 1 second while we stop